welcome to Slavery and Its Legacies, a podcast of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. Slavery and Its Legacies interviews visiting scholars, activists, and others about their contributions to the understanding of slavery, past and present, and its ongoing role in the development of the modern world.
Hello, this is Tom Thurston, and today I'm talking with C.deBaca, who is the Gilder Lehrman Center's Senior Fellow of Modern Slavery, and has been so for a couple of years now. And it's always great to talk to you. I think this is the first time we've actually got it recording, so be careful.
Well, it's great to be here for the official podcast. Tom, I think that we probably should have just had an iPod on record.
We should have
all this time.
Had something hidden away someplace and then took the best hits or something. At any rate, I kind of want to begin by, you've had a long career now in working with issues around human trafficking, what we call modern slavery, at the highest levels, serving under the Obama administration in charge of the trafficking in persons section. And I just wondered, assuming you could have done other things with your life that probably paid more, as we were just saying, what was it that drew you to this particular area?
Well, when I was coming out of law school in the early 1990s, I'd been very active as president of the Hispanic Law Students at University of Michigan at a time when a lot of the civil rights work under the 14th Amendment was starting to be weaponized against civil rights.
Right.
You started to see reverse discrimination cases. You started to see Ward Connerly and the others who were bringing electoral attacks on affirmative action. You started seeing folks suing affirmative action programs in higher education. Mm-hmm. And I was lucky enough to be part of the University of Michigan team that rewrote the affirmative action program for the law school.
Right.
As one of the students. I was the only Latino on law review my year. I was lucky enough to be involved with faculty hiring. And although I was also simultaneously basically leading the sit-ins for more faculty of color and things as the president of the Latino Law Students, I was also, I guess, enough of credentialed in the eyes of the law school to participate in that. And so for me, the idea of working on civil rights issues, whether it was having worked at MALDEF, a Mexican-American Legal Defense Fund,
right, on
voting rights issues in Texas, or the affirmative action battles at University of Michigan, we were able to write a affirmative action program that was actually then withstood Supreme Court analysis in the subsequent Supreme Court cases. So I was able to make a difference there, and I kind of knew coming out of law school that I wanted to work on civil rights issues. Mm-hmm. I was lucky enough to be selected to the Civil Rights Division's honors program. The Attorney General's honors program takes 5 or 6 students a year directly out of school. And in doing that, basically came into the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division, which enforces, at that point, the main areas were involuntary servitude and slavery, police misconduct, and racial violence.
Right.
Since then, there's been some additional statutory tools, the Federal Access to Clinics Entrances Act, the Matthew Shepard Hate Crimes Bill, that has extended the work of the criminal section to LGBTQ communities as well. But by and large, the criminal section was doing the work that had been done all the way back to the 30s. And over times, it had ebbed and flowed. In the 30s and 40s, it was very much involuntary servitude. You see at that time period the moving of the name of the program from the peonage program to the involuntary servitude program in recognition that many people weren't being held by a debt. They were being held just by overt threat of legal coercion. Right. So by the time I came into the section, it was right after Rodney King. Uh-huh. It was a few years after the Supreme Court had narrowed the scope of the slavery statutes in the case United States versus Kosminski, which basically said that we needed to look back to the understanding of the framers of the 13th Amendment as interpreted by the 1988 Supreme Court.
Right.
And they said, well, all this, Stockholm Syndrome and battered women's syndrome and all this stuff that you're bringing in about dependency and relations of power and workers' rights, all of those things were not front of mind for the framers of the 13th Amendment.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because then if you actually go look at the debates of the 13th Amendment, a lot of those concepts do show up as the radical Republicans were trying to chart a new path in Reconstruction. In some ways, they were almost describing post-Reconstruction more than they were describing the 13th itself.
They're anticipating
it in some ways. So I came into the criminal section at a time when the loss of the Kosminski case had dealt an almost, I think to the people who were there, an almost fatal blow to the involuntary servitude and slavery program. That, I think, plus the high profile of police brutality with Rodney King, I came into a criminal section that very much was defining itself at that moment as doing police brutality and racial violence cases. But for the first time, there were a few of us from the Latino community and from the Asian community who were coming into the section. The kind of black-white paradigm of civil rights as carried out by amazing lawyers in the 1970s, some of the first female federal prosecutors in large numbers, bringing in new perspectives, et cetera. Kind of the same thing happened in the 90s with people like me, Tom Perez, Leon Rodriguez, Peggy Kuo, Tamara Miller, and others, who looked at this and said, why aren't we doing these cases? Just because the Supreme Court nailed us, we should start doing these, because we kept seeing the cases.
Yeah.
And so I think some of it was simply luck of the draw. I was in an office that for the first time in a few years was ready to kind of pick itself up off the mat and get back into the fields, get back out into the factories where people were being hurt this way. And in doing that, we ended up identifying opportunities. We ended up identifying a lot of needs and a new way forward that then becomes called human trafficking. It becomes then almost kind of as a pushback against the new name, it becomes called modern slavery. And all the time I'm sitting here doing the involuntary servitude and slavery work that I had gone there to do.
Right.
I think that, Tom, you and folks at the Gilder Lehrman Center and folks from the working group have certainly seen me sometimes scratch my head when others want to have debates about kind of the conceptual word battles that are often in here. The difference between practices similar to slavery, slavery-like practices, involuntary servitude, unfree labor, all of those things. Because the through line to me has always been what the workers, and regardless of what type of work is being done, because that's who taught me, was the people in the fields themselves.
But do you think, from what it sounds like you're saying, that as the court is like narrowing the use of the 13th Amendment as a way of kind of proceeding, is it you as a 14th Amendment civil rights person are looking at that, are taking a more expansive, or simply just using the tools that it provides to kind of take those cases that at one time may have been kind of looked at as 13th Amendment cases and using the 14th?
No, I think that it's probably one step past that. I think that often, ever since Brown versus Board of Education, the 14th Amendment has been kind of the dominant place of civil rights enforcement in the United States, which was not the case in the early years of the Civil Rights Division. The 13th was still very much a kind of an equal partner.
Sure.
I think that what we've seen with Kosminski narrowing the application of the 13th Amendment in that case, but also with the kind of time, the expiration dates of the efficacy of the 14th Amendment anti-discrimination cases, we kind of get to a point in the 1990s where the 13th has to come back in. The 14th has been weaponized against civil rights in so many ways by the reverse discrimination cases.
Right. Yeah.
And so that idea then of, especially the second section of the 13th Amendment, which says that Congress shall have the power to effectuate the 13th Amendment's prohibition, that enables you to get to badges and incidences of slavery. That enables you to get to hate crimes that aren't tied to another particular right. So you have the Byrd and Shepard Act that is passed under the 13th Amendment. You have the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 passed under the 13th Amendment as a repudiation of the Kosminski case. And what's interesting to me is that we were able to, both in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in 2000 and simultaneously with the negotiations in the UN system under Article 4 of the Universal Declaration of Rights, we were able to articulate an approach that cast itself not simply as a security or a carceral response, but rather was framed through this idea of the 3 Ps: prevention, protection, and prosecution. Up until then, you'd basically seen prosecution or border control as the only way that people dealt with whatever we call it, human trafficking, modern slavery, what have you. And that idea then of the 3 Ps as being necessary flows directly out of a kind of a rights-based approach.
Right.
This person has a bundle of rights that goes with them anywhere in the world. That right has been violated by a non-state actor, and the state has a responsibility to vindicate those rights. Once you frame it that way, as opposed to a criminal response against a breaking of the king's peace or sovereignty or what have you, once you formulate it that way, then the responsibility of the state to restore the victim whose rights had been interfered with starts to kick in. And so that's, to me, the most radical thing of the last 20 years has been this 3P paradigm that basically says that victim protection and prevention end up being co-equals to the state exercising its prosecutive power. That's pretty radical to be able to achieve in both legislation and treaty within 1 year.
Is that still kind of the current status of fight against human trafficking on the federal level, or have things changed since the Obama administration?
Well, I think that what we saw was that we passed that in the waning weeks of the Clinton administration. It was October of 2000, and suddenly within 3 weeks we were suddenly in court in Florida in Bush v. Gore. We were very lucky in the early years of the Bush administration, especially in the Justice Department, that the enforcement and the implementation, the standing up of the trafficking victim visas, expanding it so that you could even bring in family members if somebody had been victimized. I think the fact that we had 8 years of a pro-immigration Republican president in George Bush gave us a lot of running room for a kind of victim-centered approach to doing these cases. There were some other issues, especially at the State Department, with a wing of the Bush administration going pretty hard in with an anti-prostitution agenda, including funding restrictions that we very quickly turned around during the Obama administration. But by and large, we didn't have an undoing of the law that had just been passed. The kind of Clinton to Bush to Obama, in many ways, is a very good trajectory.
Right.
Certainly not what we saw in the Roosevelt to Taft to Wilson time period.
Where it's all over the map? Or?
Well, no. With Roosevelt and Taft, you have progressive Northerners who are good government, anti-corruption folks who are sending lawyers in to break up not only folks who are enslaving Italian immigrants in the South, but black folks in the South. Not surprisingly, it didn't take very long in the Wilson administration for the newly restored Southern Democrats to exactly. They didn't just play Birth of a Nation at the White House. They actually, in some ways, carried it out. And we didn't see that with George Bush, which to me, the fact that we were able to put together something that for a good 12 years or more, in fact, 12, 15 years of developing these structures, I think has made them tough enough that though some of them are very much at risk in some of the things that the Trump administration is doing, that they're proving to be resilient. There are a lot of good career people that remain in government who are out there doing victim care. But I do think that it is a time for us to be a little bit nervous because we're seeing some of the breakdown again around funding, with funding being taken from organizations with good track records of service delivery, like Catholic Charities.
Right.
Catholic Charities does work all over the world with trafficking victims, and we have a joke for those of us who've done cases that you can tell if you're really on a trafficking case because there's going to be a nun is going to show up somewhere near your workers because there's all those radical nuns who are out there. Whether it's with prostitutes on the street or whether it's with farm workers, the church is often there.
Yeah.
So the concern that people are having right now is not that the Trump administration has turned to faith-based entities for their funding. It's they're turning to folks who are using this as opportunities to proselytize. And so taking money away from Catholic Charities under a suspicion that the Catholics are a bunch of liberation theologians who are secret lefties somehow, and then turning and giving that money to Hookers for Jesus in Nevada, who requires the women to convert. If
This
they're
is
gonna
literally a group.
I am
Hookers for
telling
Jesus?
you the truth of something that happened just a few weeks ago. It is literally called Hookers for Jesus, and you can't be in their shelter unless you convert.
So good to know.
And so there's a whistleblower who brought that forward, and there's been some scandals in the last few weeks. And that is why I'm a little nervous.
What about the other thing that you hear a lot is the word is the hollowing out of various corners of the State Department and elsewhere. Is that also happening, or is there just fewer people staffing those organizations?
I think that what's been interesting on this is that both at the State Department, so shifting from Justice, which is where the Victims of Crime Act funding that I was mentioning is happening, over to the State Department. The area that we loosely call modern slavery or human trafficking is effectively run out of the State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, per the Act from 2000. But there's a pre-existing office over at the Department of Labor, International Labor Affairs Bureau.
Okay.
And there's a pre-existing office over at State, which is the Bureau of Democracy, Rights, and Labor. And those sister organizations to the trafficking office have kind of risen and fallen throughout the years, depending upon how the administrations that they're in care about human rights issues or labor rights issues, et cetera. One of the things that we've seen is that iLab at the Labor Department has been remarkably resilient during the Trump administration. I think that there are folks at the White House, don't quote me on this, I say into a microphone.
Right.
I think that there are folks at the White House who see a robust trade and guarding of labor standards in the international setting as aligning with the president's ideas on trades and tariffs. And so I don't think that we've had the folks at iLab come under fire the way that we were afraid would happen. In fact, a lot of people who used to work for me in the trafficking office are now over at iLab.
Oh, interesting.
There's just a kind of a natural cycling between the Civil Rights Division, the trafficking office, iLab, et cetera.
Right.
And they're doing phenomenal work with the annual list of goods that are made through child and forced labor and other things that feed now directly into what Customs is doing as far as when slave-made goods get brought into the United States. And maybe we can touch on that here in a bit.
Yeah.
I think that the fear is that back at the State Department, meanwhile, while the trafficking office has been doing, I think, a very good job of kind of keeping the eye on the prize. My successor, Susan Coppage, was asked to stay for a little while after the Obama administration. And so she was able to help with the transition. And then our successor, John Richmond, who's the current ambassador, was actually a Civil Rights Division alumnus who worked with me in during the Bush administration.
So sure.
And so, it's been a very, I think, organic process of leadership with somebody like Ambassador Richmond there right now. The risk, of course, is that with the White House taking a personal, in the form of Ivanka Trump, a personal attention on this, whether or not and to what extent Ambassador Richmond and the Trafficking Office are able to truly lead the entire government's effort. I was lucky enough that the folks at the Obama White House, Tina Chen, Valerie Jarrett, et cetera, even though they were very interested in it, they still were very protective of my office and my ability to be the statutory lead on those things. I think Ivanka Trump is a star that shines very brightly in this administration. And I think that John and the folks at the Trafficking Office have a challenge in how do you actually continue to do the day-to-day kind of pragmatic work of enforcing these important civil rights responsibilities. What's interesting to me about being at the GLC, which, the Gilder Lehrman Center, if it stands for nothing else, is, the place where kind of the transatlantic ideal comes from as far as thinking about slavery, not simply limited to the continental United States and the particularized history of the United States. And I feel like, in many ways, I was lucky enough to run an office that in some ways is kind of the equivalent of that. We were no longer simply seeing this as, that there's a problem of sweatshops in El Monte, California, or there's a problem with, forced prostitution on the streets of Washington, D.C. or something like that. But that this is an interrelated and interconnected world, especially as supply chains and travel and everything else make the world so much smaller. And so that idea of using the United States diplomacy for an anti-slavery agenda ends up being very natural. And it's interesting because, here at the GLC, the work of prior fellows and others, make it very clear as far as kind of the effect of anti-slavery diplomacy, whether it's the Mexican diplomacy vis-a-vis the U.S., whether it's the British diplomacy vis-a-vis the U.S., whether it's sometimes a checkered diplomacy of the United States versus Haiti and others. But the idea that slavery is somehow separate from the grand strategy and the ebb and flow of international relations over the last 300 years is simply naive.
Yes, of course. And that you're right. That is, I think, kind of central to anyone really who's looking at the history of slavery, from the big picture, is that you can't avoid seeing it as a global, transatlantic, transpacific phenomenon.
And I think that to me is one of the things that's so interesting about, what gets done here at Yale and what my fellows and prior fellows here have worked on is that, in so many ways, this is, choose your metaphor. I mean, this is a building that is being built, one brick at a time. And the knowledge that, we end up having. I remember a presentation from the 2012 Modern Slavery conference here.
Yeah.
Which I can never remember the name of.
Yeah, it was called Abolition, Past and Present, Scholars, Activists, and the Challenge of Modern Slavery in 2012.
There was...
Way back when.
There was just... It sticks with me, and I probably need to go ask somebody to borrow a copy of the article and remind myself just how good it was. But in the rearview mirror, it sure seemed like a great presentation. This woman who had been doing work on women in the gold fields in northwestern South Africa in the kind of 1870s, 1880s, at a time very similar to the United States, very similar to my part of the United States, where you end up having a imperial conquest that ends up having to deal with pre-existing forms of slavery, but then also ends up bringing in and grafting on top of it kind of the imperial forms of slavery. That's
Yeah.
very much, kind of the Southerners wanting to come into what had been northern Mexico until we woke up that day and
Right.
were told that we were Americans. But that notion of kind of the northern frontier in South Africa and how these slaveries worked themselves out. And I remember hearing that presentation here. I was here to give a speech as part of it, but then I was going to get on a plane and go off to some other country right afterwards. And it was so eerily similar to the things that I had been hearing from folks in Africa about things that are happening right now.
Right now, yeah.
And to be able to hear somebody who, at the highest level of historical research, this woman had done just an amazing job with the archive to reclaim these stories. And in many ways, the stories of the girls in Namibia and southern Angola are less told, even
Sure.
in the story that she was telling.
Yeah.
The ones who I would
Right.
be one of the few people who would meet when I go out to these countries. And so to me, that idea of kind of the story, the collective story that the GLC ends up telling, starts to reflect what I saw in those years of being ambassador and being in, I don't know how many countries I was in. I think it was 90 or 100 countries on, I think, around 130 different trips. But I know I got several million frequent flyer miles out of it. So it put me in a position to kind of see, what's happening out there in the world. And that, to me, is what's fascinating about being at the Gilder Lehrman Center, because the scholarship that gets done through here and comes through here tells a very similar story to what we see out in the world.
Yeah, it's a very fortunate place to be because it does seem like the scholars from all over the world are here and working on new work. I mean, that's kind of the definition of our fellows program is.
Although I do wonder, Tom, and I want to throw a question back to you,
Oh, no.
which is, I think that what we see, and I certainly saw this when I was investigating and prosecuting cases, but I think it's the same thing at the GLC, is that, every one of the scholars who comes through has been immersed kind of in their own work. And if they're doing really good work, they're actually capturing and helping us to explain and understand something that is inherently very tragic. And yet they're so focused just on their one little aspect of it. But then at the GLC, even just 1 year's worth of reading the submissions for the Douglas Book Prize,
Right.
That notion of the GLC also being a repository of enormous anguish and enormous suffering that comes through our doors in that scholarship. And it's something that we've never talked about, but I'm always interested in kind of how do institutions and people actually deal with looking at that evil.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that I think I've struggled with myself. Just doing this kind of work as long as I have, I find that my tolerance for horror and human suffering has dropped. It hasn't. I haven't kind of got more steely about it. If anything, I'm just like increasingly more moved, where I'll be talking to a group of teachers, and I'll have to take, I guess, what we call a Romney moment, for a bit of a while to kind of compose myself, so I can just, continue to talk about these things. It is an interesting line of work.
One of the things that I've started doing in my class this year that I hadn't done as much, I think, last year, is that I'm trying to the extent possible, and some of the cases or stories that we're telling, there's been enough research done that we do have some images. But I've been trying to make sure that my class spends at least part of the class with an image of somebody up on the screen who they're dealing with. Now, that image isn't going to be of them on the worst day,
Right.
hopefully.
Yeah.
But even if it's just a passport picture of You know, On So, who's a Chinese woman who a heroic federal district court judge stepped in to prevent from being deported in the 1890s, saying we didn't fight a civil war so that this woman could be enslaved in a brothel. And then the tragedy of the second act, which is the Ninth Circuit saying we didn't pass the Chinese Exclusion Act so that this woman could be here in the United States. You know, there's something, you know, just about having to understand by looking into the eyes of that old passport photo that we have of her, not just for my class, but I think for me as well, that it's like, you know, I cannot go back in time and make things right for her.
Right.
On the other hand, there's now another group of 6 or 8 people who know her name
Right.
100 years later.
She's not a data point.
She's not forgotten. She's, you know, she still is going to be there. And frankly, hopefully it takes those students out into the world once they get their law degrees, and they're going to go out and do something for the people who they can help.
Right.
But I think it's that trying to figure out how do we personalize while still doing the kind of rigorous academic work that we expect and that we hold ourselves to at the GLC. That's something that I don't want to say that I am tormented by, but it's something that I really think a lot about.
Yeah, I think it can be a tricky balance too. You know, there's a lot of talk about, you know, using trauma in a kind of unnecessary way that I think, well, you see a lot in some of the anti-trafficking organizations that you know have kind of tropes of images that they use again and again and again as a way of kind of demonstrating trauma that after a while just starts to wash over you. And so I think it's tricky kind of thinking about how to balance that with, again, the need to personalize these people instead of making them a kind of trope.
Well, and I think especially, you know, for me as having been a trial lawyer in this area, you know, where telling these stories was not for the sake of raising money,
Right.
or passing legislation, or carrying out a particular policy agenda, although clearly we were also trying to advance a civil rights policy agenda. You know, but I remember one of the survivors in a case that I did where a advocacy NGO had gotten hold of her and took her to Congress to testify for the TVPA itself. So this would have been back in 99 or 2000. And when you go back and you read the congressional record, it's very clear from the responses that even anti-immigrant members of Congress who were there that day suddenly were saying, well, we have to do something. You know, a lot of the programs in both welfare reform and the immigration reform in 1996, when you had the Gingrich, the newly emboldened Republican Congress coming in and a weakened Clinton presidency
Right.
At that point. And you had so much law that was put into place that was affirmatively hurting trafficking victims.
Yeah.
It wasn't intended to hurt trafficking victims. It was intended to hurt poor people and immigrants. But a lot of trafficking people
They kind of
are those
the
things.
Venn diagram is
Exactly. It's pretty much of a circle.
yeah.
And it's interesting because, you know, I was looking at this to see whether I should teach that or assign that particular congressional hearing. And at the end of the day, I couldn't assign it, even though the thing that I was upset about in reading it wasn't on the pages of the congressional record. It's the fact that halfway through the testimony, I ended up having to run outside of the congressional hearing room and call our victim witness coordinator back at the Justice Department to get somebody over there who was a psychologist who could actually be ready for when that particular woman came off of the witness stand. This is not somebody who we had taken up as a witness. This was not the Justice Department's hearing. I don't think we even had anybody testifying that day. But I'd gone up because these were folks from a case that I had done.
Uh-huh.
They didn't turn to the non-governmental organization, the advocacy group that had brought them up to put them out to tell their story. They didn't turn to them as the guys on the
speak for
dais
them or to
stopped
right.
asking them these horrible questions. They came running to me. And so, I end up looking at that and I say, we got the T visas and we got victim programs and we got exemptions to the welfare law and everything else in no small part because of these two women testifying. And yet, what I remember about that day is people who I cared about, people whose stories I had been trusted with to go into court and to vindicate the rights that had been violated. And in many ways, the process that day used them very badly.
It's a blunt object.
And, and so to me, that's always been the thing that carries it forward when we're thinking about, like, how do you use imagery? The other thing I think is, now that I'm teaching the history class, putting the current use, especially of sex trafficking storytelling that happens, putting it in the context of whether it's the kind of classic seduction narrative or the melodrama narrative that flows out of the seduction narrative of the mid-1800s, with the kind of aristocratic cad, the virgin / daughter / maiden, and the family / father / society, kind of in a triangle. That is kind of the definition of melodrama.
Right.
What happens within those three then is kind of the plot of most plays and books of the 1800s. We haven't come that far when otherwise good-hearted people are turning to, how should they tell a slavery story about human trafficking today? They seem to default back to those things, as opposed to, here's someone with agency who made very rational decisions about what they would do with their lives. And because someone is a criminal and then did this thing to them, they then were enslaved. Instead, we get ourselves into these, knots as to, is this person a pure enough victim for us to care about? Or is this the right victim? Or is she mouthy to the people who tried to help her? Or is she not even a she? Male victims in Europe, it took years worth of diplomacy for us to get countries in Europe to start having victim care programs for men, because they assumed, men don't fit into my melodrama because I need a maiden or a damsel in distress. So a man can't be that. Or if I, as a European country, if you've convinced me that this is happening to those Polish guys or those guys from Thailand or whatever, if you've convinced me that it is happening, then you haven't convinced me that men would need therapy the way that women would.
Right.
Because these men just need to suck it up and get back to work.
Yeah.
And we'll give them maybe, the opportunity to go work on a different construction site.
Right.
But why would we let, because they don't fit into my melodrama triangle or my...
But instead they fit into your kind of old-fashioned notions of masculinity and what it means to suck it up and find another job.
It's been interesting because I think that a lot of the critiques that friends of mine have had historically about kind of the worst excesses of the post-2000 trafficking movement are as much... They may be aimed at trafficking, but what they're really having a problem with is the fact that trafficking exists within a context that is continually sexist, racist, capitalist, what have you.
Right.
It's trafficking somehow and slavery do not somehow then change all of us so that we're not in a world in which that old melodramatic triangle is the way that we tell stories.
Yeah.
And I've always wanted to respect the concerns that people have, but at the same time being like, okay, well, we can and we must deal with, the fact that folks from Calvinist religions are much more likely to want to open their own shelter, and folks from a Catholic tradition are much more likely to want to have a hierarchy involved. Those then, out of that flows very different responses from people who want to do something about slavery and trafficking. But what that's really telling me is that there are pre-existing ways of doing things in these communities.
Right.
And if I'm going to come in and say, well, I need you to help with prevention, protection, and prosecution, then I need to not only know the religious background, but I need to know, with a country, I need to know what their colonial past was, where they think of themselves as their source of law, what their slavery histories were, both reality and their imagined slavery histories, as to what stories are they telling themselves about slaveries in the past. And only once I understand that am I able to then have a conversation, hopefully, about people who are currently suffering this form of modern slavery. But I think that what happens is that everybody wants to jump right in, whether it's out of good-heartedness or what have you, and take an ahistorical intervention and just jump in and say, well, you should do something.
Yeah. Because this is the preconceived container that this problem fits into without any regard to the history of slavery and colonialism and what have you that's existed in this place.
And sometimes literally a container. I mean, if you think about, how many, television shows, especially during the Bush administration when it was first kind of coming out, were being literalists about the word trafficking.
Right,
And so everything...
Have to have a vehicle involved in some way or another.
Have to have a vehicle, have to have a shipping container. There's always that scene where you open up the shipping container and there's a bunch of improbably beautiful Russian women inside of the shipping container.
Right.
When the reality of the cases that we were doing in those years with improbably beautiful Russian women, they had flown into the United States on whether it was tourist visas or on temporary work visas or student visas, and then had been taken to where the mafia was going to put them. You don't lock that type of trafficking victim into a shipping container unless you are Hollywood.
Yeah.
But the reason that Hollywood uses the shorthand of the shipping container or transit or things like that is because I think that those 1880s motifs are so powerful. I was lucky enough to be at a conference at Texas State University in October of last year, and Jessica Pliley, who was a fellow before me and was a leader of the Modern Slavery Working Group here.
Exactly.
And I, were able to spend some really good time together. And one of the things that we were laughing about is that, you can take the images that both she and I use in our teaching and our research from the 1880s, 1890s.
Mm-hmm.
When you start to get this, simultaneous to, in the United States, you've got slavery cases being done on behalf of African American, Native American, Latino, and even little Italian immigrant children for being enslaved.
Right.
And yet, under the guise of protecting against coerced prostitution, you then end up having this entirely different set of laws that comes in under the Commerce Clause and is all about regulating our borders,
right,
and all about regulating women, but then uses all of the words of slavery for the emotive conduct. It's called the White Slave Trafficking Act. I try not to call it that myself because it requires neither whiteness nor slavery.
Right.
And so if that's the case, why should we call it by its fake name? But what's so interesting is that I think both Jessica and I, she studies the White Slave Trafficking Act, which in the United States becomes the Mann Act, M-A-N-N. Congressman Mann, I think what a lot of people don't understand about him is that he was also the architect of the Food and Drug Administration, the Interstate Commerce Commission, and he introduced the 19th Amendment. And so here is a reformist politician
Modernizing.
who was a modernizer, who was actually thinking about having, you know, a national, kind of national level control, but for good things,
Yeah.
regulation of drugs and interstate
Right.
commerce and all this other stuff. But he defaults to this commerce idea in no small part because everybody had been saying, well, if it's white women and prostitution, then this is the law for you. And meanwhile, the other half of
Right.
the country, it's the involuntary servitude and slavery laws. So you have these two laws travel in parallel for 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is that in many ways, up until the 2012 conference and up until the Modern Slavery Working Group here, that the academy and the people who study each of those laws travel in parallel. And those are parallels that are not talking to one another.
Yeah.
And so Jessica and I ended up realizing that we had often used the same when you think about him from a modern perspective, you realize how sexist and racist some of these presentations are of the diabolical, dapper, dark man twisting his mustache in the train station,
Right.
recruiting a young girl from
naive
Eastern
things,
Europe,
right,
but then you realize that is pretty much the exact same thing as the posters that Department of Homeland Security is using today.
Yeah.
And I think that that's one of the things that's been interesting to me about the Gilder Lehrman Center is that you see just through the work, say for instance, that having people like Jessica and Zoe Trott. I mean, that's one of the podcasts of note that you did back in the day. It's enabling us to bring those two areas of study or those two siloed inquiries together in a way that just hadn't been done, frankly, for 100 years. And if anything is that separate for 100 years, you have to start interrogating why was it kept that separate for 100 years. I don't think there was a puppet master out there trying to necessarily keep it separate, but these concepts, which should be unitary, if you're truly looking at whether or not somebody is being held in coerced service. If you're using it as a rhetorical talking point for prostitution policy or wage hour policy or labor relations or something like that, then that opens up other things. But if you're talking about whether or not people should not be held in coerced service, regardless of what the underlying service is, then these two areas of law and inquiry should have been lashed together for all this time.
Right.
And in some ways, the only way that's happening now is in the last decade, and thankfully here at Yale.
Yeah, and I think that that was something that, as an organization, we realized that we weren't in a position to kind of advance new policy or something like that. We, are historians, and so what we can do is try to aggregate people who can begin to tell those histories. And I don't think we had any idea what we were getting into, but I mean, your work here at the law school is certainly, a great example of kind of trying to kind of pull this story together and make sense of it.
Well, and I think that one of the things that has always struck me, and I think that some of it is that our director David Blight, coming from a land-grant college,
Yep.
Coming out of Michigan State, as much as it pains me as a Wolverine to say.
I don't have a dog in that fight.
Well,
so.
we actually, I think the fight is more for the fun of it, really, when it
Yes,
comes
of
down
course.
to it.
All sports is.
Exactly. But I think one of the things that the GLC, perhaps more than some other places in the kind of stereotypical ivory tower, that idea that the scholarship and the thought has to be out in the world, and whether that is in the work with the high schools, with the teachers, with the new project on the ongoing legacies of slavery, all of the things that we're trying to do at the GLC necessarily can't simply be, a important academic article that 1,000 people will read
Right.
and be affected by on a good day. You can't stop there. It has to be out there making that kind of a difference. And I think that to me is one of the things that's exciting, that not only, is the work at the law school, but with the architecture school I was over earlier today, we're working up a class that, will actually try to use the architecture school's studio process where they're actually, taking on with people like Frank Gehry, here at the architecture school, taking on a building project, but we're hoping to overlay on top of that the students and a mixture of students from the law school, School of Management, and School of Architecture, where they'll actually have to be looking from the beginning of an architectural project as to what kind of slavery impact their choices of building materials and processes would end up having. It's not something that nobody's ever tried to do. Architects have historically said, like Zaha Hadid famously said about the Qatar projects, I draw plans, I draw beautiful stadiums. It's not mine to
Right.
worry about whether these men are enslaved. For the first time, we have, the leading school of architecture in the United States, if not the world, basically saying, we want to work with the GLC so that we can bring this kind of ethical teaching into our methodology. And I think that's something that, whether it was the GLC working on the response of Yale to the legacies of slavery and slave holders and slavery supporters here on campus, like John C. Calhoun, to the potential of, maybe we can get slave-free chocolate into the dining halls. To me, that's the thing that makes the GLC special, is that we're not simply cranking out great scholarship, though the GLC is definitely doing that, but at the same time trying to be out in the high schools and the cafeterias and the other professional schools here in New Haven.
Well, thanks for that, and thanks for the part you're playing in all this, because the work you're doing, of course, is bringing these studies out to the larger world. And there is something satisfying about having a job where you can think to yourself, I'm making a difference. And we've kind of run out of time, but I have a feeling there's much more we could say, and I'm looking forward to our next conversation.
Well, with this having turned into a multi-year fellowship, maybe that means that we'll end up having to turn it into a multi-podcast series.
That sounds like a very good idea. It's great having you, Lou.
Thanks, Tom.
Slavery and Its Legacies is brought to you by the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition, a part of the Whitney and Betty McMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale University. Additional support is provided by the Rabina Foundation, and production support is provided by the Yale Broadcast Center. For more information about the Gilder Lehrman Center, its activities, and this podcast, visit glc.yale.edu.